Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk a little bit about narcotics, drugs. How did this all start to where the police and law enforcement became involved in one of the major things that law enforcement and investigative teams do in the United States? But the whole idea of how we put drug investigations together, how do we go about it, and how do we present cases in front of courts? Not one of the easiest things to do. It's very political, but we're going to kind of just get into that a little bit. For those of you that find this topic even intriguing, I guess at best, we do offer an upper division class, which I teach, Drugs and Crime, where we go about talking about all of these different reasons should law enforcement be involved in this. But at this point, this is an investigations class. Certainly, it's one of the most arrests that are made, the most cases that are presented in front of a district attorney have to do with narcotics and drugs. So because of that, we're going to talk about it. Domestic violence, probably number one. On top of that, drug investigations. So when we use the term drugs and crime, remember, it is going to be the idea and what is a drug. The drug, if going back to like the DARE days, for those of you that are old, if you're not, you don't understand, we defined a drug as something that enters the body and then affects the way your body or your mind operates. So this can incorporate all kinds of different things that humans have decided over time to ingest for whatever reason. Since the beginning of time that we have kept records of criminal justice, there has been no society that has been drug-free. So yes, it is going to be there. People are going to try, for a variety of different reasons, are going to try and take things into their body to, whether it's alleviate pain, whether it's an addiction, but some way to change the way their mind and their body operates. So let's at least start there. Is it political? Absolutely. Depending on which drug we're talking about, there are so many different drugs out there on the market, and you're going to hear all kinds of different philosophies based on what we should do, what we shouldn't do. I will tell you this, I want you to be thinking of one important thing, and that's the Constitution. When we talk about the Fourth Amendment, and we talk about the government's ability to invade your house, your territory, that expectation from the Constitution, that you have an expectation to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, drugs and drug investigations and drug arrests are where we really push government's power upon the people in the United States. So absolutely it's going to be controversial. As we start to see many states decide that marijuana, for instance, should be legalized. In fact, the majority of states at this point have decided that marijuana shouldn't be illegal. Most states have said that it does have medicinal benefits. So yeah, it can become very political. Alcohol, no different. As we talk about certain drugs, alcohol absolutely is a drug, but it's not considered to be illegal anymore because in the United States, we went through that period. We made an amendment saying that we wanted to try and prohibit it, and we realized that prohibition was just not an effective tool to deal with people that abuse alcohol. So, alcohol, is it a drug? Yes. Do we do investigations for simple possession and use? No. The number one cause of death by any drug is not alcohol, for those of you who are wondering. It's going to be nicotine. Can you legally smoke? Yeah, unless you're a minor. So again, politically, we're not going to try and approach it. We certainly are going to talk about, at this point in time, the investigations that take place in the United States are based on the idea that there are certain drugs that are bad and that the government should protect you from you. And we're going to approach it in that sense, not getting involved in the conservative, the liberal, the libertarian ideology on this topic. Just understand that the majority of what investigators do in the United States, police officers, federal agents are dealing with drugs and narcotics. So it takes up a big portion of what we do. When we go about looking at all the different things about narcotics, remember, every state is going to have a different set of laws based on these narcotics issues. We talked briefly about marijuana. In some states, recreationally, you can use them. And we have said that states, in most cases, can do what they want. They have that ability to, the states' rights are more important sometimes than the federal government overreach. So in states like Nevada and California and Arizona that choose to have marijuana as a recreational drug, it's not criminal any longer, and there's not a lot of investigation done on those particular types of drugs. Whereas in Utah, where we're at, they haven't chosen that path. And so again, there will be investigations based on Utah's desire to go after someone with marijuana. So again, state by state, department by department, they're all different. Let's go back historically and at least understand, how did we get to this point? Why did law enforcement get involved in the investigation of drugs and drug activity? It really amped up in the 1960s and the 70s. Vietnam era, during that protesting of the war environment, there was a lot of people that were using drugs in the United States. So a particular side of the government decided, we're going to go after these people that are using these drugs. And so this is the first time we see an aggressive upscale attack with law enforcement and the investigative natures and going after people that are using and selling drugs. This is in the 60s and the 70s. During the 1980s, it was amped up again, where we heard the phrase for the first time, a war on drugs. So when we hear the war on drugs, it typically came from the 1980s. And it was the idea, again, that we're going to stop people from using things. We're going to go after people that are supplying these things. I will tell you, from a criminologist perspective and a law enforcement perspective, we really haven't won that war on drugs. It was started in 1980. Really the idea to go after people that are supplying it from wherever on the planet. A lot of it's happening from within, but we really haven't put much of a dent in any of the drugs that come into the United States or what we make. Nor have we really stopped people's desire to want to use those drugs. So it's very, very political, but understand that since 1970, we've stayed in this idea that the government's going to go after people that are using drugs. And we're going to use all of the power that we have, the investigative nature, to go after that because of all the bad side effects that these drugs might have. So put that kind of behind you, the politics of it, and let's talk a little bit about, the legal definitions. I mean, we typically put drugs or narcotics into 5 schedules. We call it scheduling. The DEA typically goes in and decides that a Schedule 1 narcotic are those that we consider to be very destructive. They're ones that if you take them, you can be very addicted to them. And they're ones that most of the time, this is where law enforcement concentrate on. So we have 5 schedules. We have typically stimulants and we have depressants, depending on which category. And when we break these different types of drugs down, and we're not going to do a lot of it in this class, but understand, drugs typically fall into one of 2 categories. A depressant slows your heart rate, slows your breathing, and this drug will make you operate very, very slow. As opposed to the stimulants, raises your heart rate, raises your blood pressure, and it makes your heart rate up, your blood pressure up. And so this drug is quite a bit different than the depressant. And these are typically what we try and do. Keep in mind, in my field of work, I think a lot of people that have never used any drugs at all, they've never drank, they've never smoked, they sometimes get caught up in the idea that when we talk about narcotics and drugs, that it's only the illegal ones that are on the street that are being sold and produced in an illegal market. Keep in mind, that's not the case. In fact, we have a large portion of what we go after in law enforcement and investigate are prescription drug medications. People that use medications that are prescribed by the doctors but they overuse them, they abuse them. Remember, drug abuse can be with a prescription as well as street level narcotics. It's really just abusing, using it in a way that it was not intended. So again, don't forget that prescription medications come in many different categories. And when we look at investigative work that's tied to DUIs, it's not just about alcohol. There's a lot of DUIs out there, a lot of investigative work in nature that is done based on us dealing with people that are impaired, that are not, they shouldn't be behind the wheel of a vehicle. We know that's going to hurt somebody when you're impaired, not only on alcohol, but on all of the other narcotics and the drugs that we've just previously spoken about. And clearly, and it's nothing new today, we have a lot of drugs that are involved in just entertainment. You know, we call these the club drugs, whether it's, you know, ecstasy, MDMA, ketamine. There's a lot of drugs out there that a lot of people, they just want to go to clubs and for a period of time really just have their mind altered in such a way. And again, based on the scheduling of the DEA, the investigative nature involved depends on where it falls in that scheduling. Even with body enhancements, when we talk about body enhancements, steroids, things that people take into their body that we typically don't see as mind altering, you know, the typical drugs that you hear on, steroids and other drugs that are made illegally and are used by people are also drugs that we will go after, different scheduling. So again, keep in mind there's lots of different scheduling, lots of different time at play based on the investigative nature. So when you're reading the chapter, look at all of the different ways that we go about doing the investigation. Many of the things that we do in law enforcement are controversial. One of those things that we do in the investigating of narcotics is absolutely using confidential informants. Again, we're going to put aside all of the different reasons that certainly law enforcement have done things that shouldn't have been done. But with regards to drug investigations, narcotic investigations, extremely important in order to get the job done to have confidential informants. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to go out as an investigator, a detective, a special agent working for the DEA, FBI, we really don't want those agents, police officers using drugs, using these things we're talking about in an attempt to arrest people. So going out in that environment and playing that undercover role, extremely difficult to do because we don't want to put law enforcement agents in that predicament. So if we don't, we use people that are already doing that. We call these informants. People can be working with the law enforcement agents for a number of reasons. Yes, the number one reason is they're in trouble. They would like to have consideration. Remember, that's not law enforcement's superpower. That's the prosecutor can give that, give that break to these people that work with law enforcement. Sometimes these confidential informants are simply just trying to make money. They want to give over information to law enforcement. And yes, law enforcement, whether it's local, state, or at the federal level, confidential informants can make money if they give us information leading to an arrest. Again, one of those things that's extremely controversial. Should we in the government business be making money from people doing something illegal? We're not going to get into it in this course. Understand, informants can make money. Yes, we do pay them. And then many times informants that are selling drugs on the street want to give us information about somebody that's their competition. So informants are used heavily. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. We use them heavily in the investigative nature and putting case together in narcotics. We use them because they live in a world that we typically don't. And we usually, in order to make the investigative arrests, we have to do things like get exceptions to the Fourth Amendment. Remember, if I believe somebody's doing things within a residence, according to the Constitution, I have to have a warrant and affidavit signed by a judge. Typically, that information, that probable cause, comes from the information that we receive from an informant, or what we call a controlled buy. A controlled buy is simply we are orchestrating our informant, watching them, surveilling them, going into a location where they will buy a controlled substance, a narcotic, a drug, come out to us, and then after doing this several times, we then go to a judge with all of the facts and circumstances, our probable cause, and we say to the judge, based on everything that we've observed with our informant, we would like to have a warrant to then go into this residence, violating their Fourth Amendment, to look for the drugs and the things that we believe is happening inside. So the Fourth Amendment, and when you see things on the news about breaching and about going into places, and again, many of the shootings we're involved in, a lot of the use of force, a lot of times we make mistakes, we go into the wrong house. A lot of things that we do in law enforcement that you see on the news, a lot of this had to do with enforcing, investigating drugs and narcotic activity. So it's one of those things. If you believe drugs should be investigated by law enforcement, understand, yeah, things are going to happen that sometimes we don't want them to happen, but they do. It's very, very dangerous when we go about the investigative nature of this. We knew this during Prohibition with alcohol. The violence went up significantly when we made it illegal. And as we're doing with all of the drugs, as we continue to make it illegal, investigating these cases are extremely violent. A lot of violence involved in this. So again, don't underestimate the amount of training that you're going to need when you put cases together. In most departments, if you're going to work in narcotics, we call it vice. Narcotics, typically you're going to have specialized training. We call it DRE, drug recognition experts. You're going to have some knowledge really about addiction, about people that abuse drugs, how to recognize them, the things that they're doing. You're going to have some knowledge about when they're using these drugs, what typically is the body doing, blood pressure up, blood pressure down. So the extra training typically is something after an academy. So if you go to the FBI Academy, Quantico, you're going to get extra training for DRE, just as if you are working for local law enforcement within Cedar City or the state of Utah. So DRE is absolutely, if this is something that you want to do, investigate narcotic activity. When you get out of an academy, absolutely get the training so that you can then go and do your job much better. Now remember, typically what we do is, as a nation, we've kind of moved back a little bit with the investigative work on just people that are using the simple possession and simple addictive nature of drugs. Not a lot of investigative work done in most departments. Most of the emphasis is going after those people that are producing it, those people that are selling it, making a profit off of it, and using large quantities. The whole idea that they're selling and they're selling it and distributing it, those are usually the targets that we go after. One of the most important things in narcotics and confidential informants is this idea that we do follow surveillance. Surveillance becomes extremely important as well. In order to decide and figure out your probable cause, these locations where drug activity is happening, we're going to have to surveil certain locations. We'd have fixed surveillance on certain sites. If we're following somebody that we think is actually selling things, we might have a moving surveillance. So again, surveillance and the techniques we use in following people, those are typically trainings that we do after an academy. Extremely important training. I highly recommend, again, surveillance training, confidential informant training, drug recognition, expert training as well. All three important, separate blocks of training to help you do your job better. Let's talk about undercover. We hear this a lot, undercover. It's in the movies, and it's, you see it a lot. We just don't do it a lot. Like I said at the beginning of the lecture, we don't want to put police officers, special agents in locations that we are going to put them in positions that we really don't want them violating the law. So we don't do it like we used to in the 60s and 70s We're learning how to do our job better. Do we have undercover agents? Absolutely. Do we have police officers that work in a position of trying to conceal? Absolutely. While working in narcotics like I did, yeah, we call it a plain clothes assignment. You're not dressed in a uniform, you're in plain clothes, and you're out there doing your job. But the idea that you're going in and infiltrating some of these organizations, we don't see that a lot. But depending on the size of the departments, remember, in most small departments, which is what happens in the United States, most are small departments, you might have just one or two detectives working all narcotics investigations. In big departments across the country, you might have an extremely large team that just does street level narcotics, and then a whole other team that does the high level, high end type of narcotics. So the narcotics investigations really depends on how many officers that you have, how much money that you're able to allocate into this. Because as we do investigate and we go after the people doing this, a lot of times a lot of money is used to purchase some of these narcotics in order to ultimately get the probable cause to put our case together. And remember, just like in every other case that you put together, we have to do the best job we can to give all of our probable cause to the prosecutor so that they can do their job without having issues such as suppression of evidence because we've done things that we should have not done. Always, always be thinking about the Constitution. Always be thinking about things such as Miranda, things, the Fourth Amendment. We do not want to violate people's rights. So when we decide to do these investigative things, always keep in mind, do it in such a way that we know we're doing our job. The government's duty is to protect the Constitution and act within the Constitution, that we're playing the game the way we're supposed to, so that when we put the case together, the prosecutor can spend their time looking at the evidence, not doing a lot of things trying to figure out or explain why did the government do these things. So again, keep the Constitution in mind at all levels when you're going through the investigations of these things. It is extremely important to state before we leave, because you are going to go on reading about organized crime. A lot of organized crime and the money that they make, organized crime falls into many categories, whether it's gangs, motorcycle gangs, street gangs, but a lot of the activities and the money that they produce for their gangs and organized crime is derived from narcotics activity, selling these narcotics. So absolutely, we have to navigate through the politics, figure out how to do things, because we can all agree that when we go about dealing with organized crime, gangs, drugs is attached to that at every level. So narcotic investigations becomes extremely important. So again, if this is something that you really want to know a lot about, we teach an upper division class. At this point, just understand that I couldn't teach a class on investigations without first emphasizing that a majority of what policing in the United States is at this moment in time is going after narcotics, drugs, and so this is extremely important to understand all the things that you're going to read about. If you have questions, send me an email, and we'll see you on the next one.